Asia Tech Podcast with Graham Brown and Michael Waits.
My name is Michael Waits, and we're talking from the Asia Tech Podcast Stories. I'm calling Peter, who is in Tokyo. I am in Bangkok. Peter, good morning.
Hey, Michael, good morning. How are you?
Let's go back to this. So I think it's actually shocking that we've never met, and I'll tell you why. You have been in Japan since when? 1990?
90.
Exactly. So was I. So I landed in
Okay.
I landed in February 20th of 1990. My first day in the offices of Morgan Stanley in Tokyo was February 21st. So I didn't even get a break. I was living in a small apartment in Hatagaya, which is familiar probably to you, but probably to very few other people listening to this podcast. And
Sure.
I left at the end of 2011, and you can probably do the math and figure out why.
Right.
So why don't we just go through a little bit of your background
Yes.
as well, and then we can talk about all of the sort of fascinating things that you've been doing in the tech sector and in other sectors since 1990.
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, I came to Japan in around 1990, and I came as a student. At that time, Japan was very much focused on becoming the leader in all things computer.
Right.
At that time, I was doing my master thesis, and I was focusing on things like massive parallel computing. And guess what? Artificial intelligence. That's more than 20. That's quite a while ago now. But that was kind of my starting point, and being new to Japan, I worked at a research laboratory, which was part of Hitachi, one of their Hitachi in Kokubunji. May be familiar to you,
Very.
not familiar to everybody.
Yeah, Kokubunji is not a place probably that everybody else is going to know, but fair enough.
Right. But Hitachi has its biggest research lab there, and I was a researcher there for almost 2 years, focusing on basically a combination of hardware and software and what was called semantic processing at that time.
Right.
And shortly after kind of my thesis work was done and my research work was over, I stumbled into the financial technology world. I joined Citibank in the early 90s, and I've been ever since basically working on the edge of technology and the financial world. Some people call it fintech today, but that is more or less what I've been doing most of the time. So,
Right, so I always think like when we were building trading systems back in 1994, was that fintech or not?
Well, that's kind of something I sometimes try to explain to people that, we can call it fintech. You can call anything fintech if you like, but
I think so.
But I think it's a little bit more than that. So, just being in that space doesn't really justify. I think what we were doing in those days was really focusing on how do we use technology to automate things that were happening, in the bank or in the trading companies. And financial industry has been very, very creative in using technology because it's all, as most people don't realize, there's no money. It's all in computers.
Right.
And it requires tremendous amount of engineering to make sure that it all stays safe and balances every day. So the amount of technology we were using was significant. If you were in the trading space, of course, you had trading dealing systems, advanced telephone systems, reducing the speed of making things really fast. All those things were there. And I think that was really kind of the first wave of that type of those things happening. What most people don't realize is that the ATM is now 50 years old.
Right.
Was invented in 1967. And so that was kind of, if you go back in history, you will see that the financial industry always have kind of brought out all kind of innovations quite ahead of things. When I was at Citibank, we actually used user interfaces for the ATM that were actually predates what Citibank was doing on the internet. But once the internet came, they already had all the understanding of building this kind of UIs on ATMs, and they put it on the internet. So quite interesting. Most people also won't know that Citibank actually manufactured its own ATMs up to about 10, 12 years ago. So interesting historical context.
Yeah, and I also think just as interesting as well, if you think about the context of when ATMs were introduced, right? So what were the automatic teller? People don't know kind of what the name stands for, right? The T in the ATM. But there was also a lot of noise back then around the ATMs replacing human workers and what was going to happen to bank branches and all of this sort of interesting commentary around what was going to happen to humans in the context of banking, and that humans were going to disappear from branches. And that didn't happen, which kind of leads me to today in a way. I hear a lot of conversations about what's going to happen now to human workers. Will they be replaced by robots? And frankly, an ATM is just a robot in a weird shape.
Yes, and this is kind of a wieldy wide topic. But if we just focus on the financial industry, as you were saying, ATMs didn't replace the teller. If you look at Japan specifically, Japan was a very early adapter of ATM technology, and actually was one of the most advanced countries in terms of cash recycling and doing lots of things at the ATM. It did take away some of the activity from the teller, but the teller always stayed there and doing similar things. It's only till very recently in Japan that ATMs actually work outside of branch hours. When I came to Japan, I was going
to say, I used to go down to the bank at like 4:00 on a Friday afternoon to the Citibank branch in the Ote Center building to get cash for the weekend because it wasn't open on Saturday.
Yes, exactly. And when I was at Citibank, we worked very hard to turn it into weekend connectivity and 24/7. But the real problem is that Citibank was part of the bank's network, and it wasn't really Citibank. It were the other banks that would not be available. But we started to offer cash withdrawal and deposit on the weekends and then 24/7, etc. But it could only happen on Citibank ATMs. And as you know, Citibank had a relatively small ATM network.
Yes.
But it was very strong in overseas ATMs. So the whole idea behind the 24/7 ATM wasn't so much withdrawing cash in Japan, but it was really the service for Citibank's customers to go abroad, and then wherever they are, in what time zone they are, always be able to withdraw cash. And that was kind of one of the selling points of the Citibank account in those days. So the convenience that we now kind of start to take for granted. It took so many years for other banks to follow, and even now, most Japanese banks are scrambling to do something because I think they all want to have something in place before the Olympics in terms of servicing overseas customers. So you see, if you go to a big Mizuho branch or whatever, you'll find in a corner you'll find an ATM that says you can withdraw overseas cash on this ATM and not the other ones. So if you look at it, very much glacier speed in terms of that type of innovation. But if you look at what's happening in terms of what the teller is doing, if you go to Europe or whatever, increasingly branches are being closed down. And that's not because of the teller machines. It's because of people are able to do their banking business over their mobile phones.
Right.
And I think that the mobile phone really is the one that killed the teller, not so much the robot or the automated teller machine. So it's kind of interesting to think about that. Sometimes automating the thing you're doing may not be the end to a means. It could be a complete different way of having that service that takes care of that service or experience. So.
Right, and if, like you said, I think if you consider the fact that the ATM was invented back in the 60s, really became ubiquitous in the 70s and early 80s, and in Japan didn't even become a 24/7 service until the 2000s, because I remember we used to use Citibank as kind of our backup. Most of us got paid into an automatic account in New York.
Okay.
And when Citi went to 24 hours with their ATM machines, it was like a paradigm change in the way we could live our lives on the weekend.
Absolutely.
I'm not kidding.
Absolutely.
I know that
absolutely.
Silly.
Yes. But if you think about it, it's lots of progress, but it is also lots of progress over lots of amount of time.
Yes.
And that's kind of what makes banking interesting, because it is a very complex, thing. And now with fintech and all these things happening today, there is so much activity that is trying to find ways around it, and that makes it really interesting today.
Yeah, and I guess you've been lucky is probably the wrong word, but you've been able to experience some really interesting things. I mean, back in the day, right? Shinsei Bank was one of the Japanese banks that was that a Ripplewood purchase, if I remember correctly?
Yes, yeah, exactly correct.
Right, so Ripplewood went in and bought Shinsei. Did you know John Fletcher, by the way?
I'm not familiar with John.
Okay, because John was obviously, I think, also in tech at Shinsei, but one of the foreign banks, if I remember. I mean, one of the Japanese banks that was bought by one of the foreign companies. Anyway, but
okay.
What you saw probably at Shinsei was a big introduction of technology, which it looks like you were leading at the time. Is that not correct?
Yes. So actually, after spending close to 10 years with Citi, the opportunity to join Shinsei Bank was a once in a lifetime.
Yes.
For the listeners, Shinsei Bank came out of the bankruptcy of the Long-Term Credit Bank of Japan, which was one of the three leading industrial banks that after the Second World War was over, were really commissioned to provide, basically unlimited amounts of cash to Japanese industry to grow. And it had a specific law that protected it from other banks, and it could offer higher interest and lower tax or whatever to make deposits very, very profitable for people who deposit, primarily actually for corporate depositors. And then it would use that to basically fund the growth of companies like Toshiba, Hitachi, Sony, etc.
Right.
So it was a very, very important, very large bank. And at the end of the 90s, when lots of things were under pressure, was kind of a slow, the bubble was kind of a super pressure cooker that really slowly deflated. And the Long-Term Credit Bank was one of the very few big victims of that. And it's one of the very rare occasions in Japan that the bank went bankrupt.
Yep, I remember.
And it was a big thing. And so added with bankruptcy, when the Japanese government was looking for a buyer, as you mentioned, Ripplewood was the consortium of foreign investors that took over the bank from the government. And with that came kind of a mandate to rebuild a new bank out of the remainders of Long-Term Credit Bank. Long-Term Credit Bank was really very much a corporate bank. It didn't have much of investment banking, nor did it have retail banking. And so my attraction was to get an opportunity to go really from scratch and see what we could do, both in terms of corporate investment banking, but specifically in terms of retail banking.
Yeah, and do you want to talk a little bit about the founding of Monix as well? I remember when Monix Securities, the whole Monix,
yes.
Was it Monix Beans actually back in the day, right?
Well, no, it wasn't Monix Beans,
Nico Beans, sorry.
No, Nico Beans, right? So very correctly, around the same time, I think it's 1999, Monix was founded, and Monix really was founded by Oki Matsumoto, and he was a Goldman Sachs partner, and he took also the one time in a live opportunity when the deregulation happened of the over-the-counter market for security brokerage. He took the chance to create an online broker. He was not alone. There's a few other online brokers that started around the same time, like SBI or Kaba.com, etc. But he took and so Oki went and created a team, and he got investors, including Sony, etc. And he set up one of the first online retail brokers in Japan. That kind of is a parallel story to what happened at Shinsei. Actually, Oki was one of the external directors of Shinsei Bank during most of the first 10 years. And it was really, online retail broker is kind of a 100% online business. Similar to Shinsei, when we started our retail banking, we really focused only on the internet. And if you may remember, year 2000 kind of sounds like, internet was there, but people had a hard time to believe that we would have voice over IP.
Yeah.
People had a hard time to believe that we could do banking over the internet. This is pre-smartphones. At that time, we were still very, very much excited about iMode.
Right, very.
Which kind of had so much potential at that time.
I remember it well, actually.
Right. Yes. So we built interfaces with Docomo to do the first mobile banking in Japan and stuff like that, and so those were kind of the heydays of lots of greenfield. You could basically you could be the first in almost anything at that time.
Yeah.
And which we were with Shinsei Bank. We did things that nobody else had done. Just to go back to our funny story about ATMs, I think we were the first and still the only bank in Japan. I'm not working anymore, but at that time we were the only bank in Japan that removed all teller equipment and activity from the teller counter. And we didn't remove the people, but we needed to do that because we wanted to have the people behind the counter help customers, with their investment strategies and stuff like that. And we just moved all of that activity to the ATM inside the branch, but behind the counter there you would not see a single piece of cash. So I think some of those things were very interesting to do. So how do you change your whole interaction model with customers? Instead of having them pull a number at the entrance, How do you welcome them and say what do you want to do with your money instead of take a number and get out of here, right? So it's kind of like a hospital, right? So I think there were lots of things, and I think Oki did the same thing. He focused on how can I create an amazing experience online for people to trade, and I think Monix has very much succeeded in that.
They have. I mean, they were clearly one of the pioneers in the fact that I think it was actually one of the first of these online companies to list on the TSE as well. Is that not correct?
Yes.
Because they merged with Nico Beans, I believe.
Yes. So exactly. So what happened is after I don't have the numbers right, but around 2004 or 5 or something, Nico Beans merged with Monix, and that created it was kind of inorganic growth strategy, and that created an even bigger broker after that. So it allowed Monix to expand its customer reach, but also, some people may not know it, it also allowed them to get access to a better platform. So they migrated all the customers on what Nico Beans was using as a technology, and that allowed it to grow further.
Very interesting. And I'll say this: as if your professional life wasn't interesting enough up until now, then you went to Keio University.
Well, that's kind of something. Yes. Well, I didn't go in terms of left my job.
Leaving your job. You went there, and were you really working on the blockchain back in 2008?
No, of course not. We didn't.
I didn't think so. It didn't exist. I didn't think so. I just wanted to make sure.
Was about to be born, but no. My affiliation with Keio actually dates from the work we were doing at Shinsei Bank. And one of the things we focused on almost from the beginning of year 2000 was how can we use the internet for everything we do in the bank. And some people may not realize, but even today, many banks are very much using what are called dedicated lines. You're all familiar with this, lease lines. In those days, ISDN lines were typically used as backups. And lease lines were basically physical pieces of copper that would connect you between, let's say, the head office and the branches and stuff like that. And what's kind of interesting, I mean, today's, if you think about it today, that copper there's no encryption, nothing on that. But you would assume it was very safe because NTT or your telephone company was in charge of that line, and therefore it must be very safe. We know a whole lot better today that that is very much wishful thinking. But in those days, those were kind of the assumptions. Also, it gave you kind of a certain guarantee about the capacity you would get through the line. So what we started to do is said, well, the internet is actually a very redundant network. It sometimes may not connect, but overall you always get a connection. So how can we use that technology to do everything we do in the bank? So how do we connect the branches over the internet? How do we connect to the customer over the internet? How do we put the whole call center on IP? So no fixed, traditional telephony, all those things. So we've been working on that throughout Shinsei's days. So when somewhere around 2008, in Keio there is a very famous professor, Ju Morai, and he's kind of seen as the father of the internet in Japan. And so he really was one of the pioneers in the very early days that put the first access points in and started to build out, all literally the backbone of the internet, and then all the things that connected around it. And he collected lots of people at Keio University that helped him with that. But he also created a consortium of industry companies and researchers in other universities that started to focus on building the internet. And that project is still alive. It's called the WIDE project. Okay. And that kind of started in 2008. That started well before 2008. But in 2008, Morai Sensei was introduced to us by Joe Ito, and he said, go talk to these guys because they're doing something exciting in the banking space. So in June, when he saw what we were doing, he said, wow, nobody's really trying to do that in the banking world. So he wanted to really bring us in and share what we were doing. And so we did some more experiments, and we started working on that. So that kind of got me connected into that. You mentioned blockchain. Blockchain wasn't there in those days, but if you talk about distributed trust or building things that are not centralized, some of those concepts are not entirely alien to myself. Actually, in the bank, if you remember, you have the concept of maker and checker. which was kind of a very primitive version of how do you have one person do something and another person verify that it's correct. And in a distributed trust network, that's more or less what you're doing. You basically have people check each other and you keep that in balance. But it is done in a way more a comprehensive manner using very advanced cryptography.
Right.
And if you go 10 years ago, 50 years ago, lots of that stuff actually existed in terms of technology or concept. But the speed things took and the ability to do this really fast didn't exist. So I think we have gone a long way. So my connection to blockchain is more recently. Over the last few years, I've been very much interested, obviously, in what that could do, not only in terms of Bitcoin or financial, but in general.
Right.
How can you use
a distributed ledger? Yeah. How do you
distributed ledger?
Right.
Yeah.
How do you use a blockchain distributed ledger to figure out how it interacts with an entire financial system? I think is really a fascinating conversation.
Yes.
And
yes, but
go ahead.
Yes.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. So it's not only the financial system.
Of course.
You can use it. There's many other application areas, I think, which we have not touched yet in society, where we can bring in much more reliable digital bookkeeping than we have today. So I think we're just scratching the surface. And this year, end of last year, Monix Sensei at KO started a blockchain lab, and I was very happy to join that. But this just last month, that kind of evolved into a new initiative, very much similar to the White project I talked about. Mm-hmm. It's called BASE, and it's the same idea. It's an academic focused network of researchers, not contained to KO, but other universities like Tokyo University, etc. But also will bring in industry leaders to kind of create a consortium and to focus in Japan on blockchain technologies, and specifically not just the financial industry, but very much cross industries, trying to find possible application areas and do more research around the core technology and see how we can make that robust and scalable for many generations to come.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I don't even want to talk about the blockchain, and I'll tell you why. I mean, I do, but I don't. And I'll tell you why, because I feel like, and maybe we can talk now about you coming back on the show and talking more about the technology around the blockchain, and I'll tell you why. I spent a lot of time actually doing my own research on the blockchain, the technology itself, but also its implication on the larger society. And like you said, it's more than just something that people can use to create cryptocurrencies. The concept of a distributed ledger and the impact that it's going to have on potentially all facets of life where, technology is now ubiquitous, but even in places where technology isn't ubiquitous, how it's going to impact this whole concept of verification, electricity use, whatever, the whole concept of what's going on in the blockchain. And also, there's the original blockchain on which Bitcoin sits. There's Ethereum. There are whole host of companies using the blockchain for things for which it was never potentially intended. If you go back and read the original white paper on it, which I'm sure you have.
Right.
But there's a lot of ink has been spilt already on this, but most of that ink has been spilt by people that have no idea what they're talking about. So it'd be really interesting for me and you, I think, to get back on a call maybe later and spend some time really talking about this and digging deeper, because this is a subject that's really close to me. Do you know a guy named Robert Hogan? So Robert was actually set up. He was a guy at Deutsche Bank that I worked with, and also worked with him at Morgan Stanley. But Robert's done a lot of work. One of the greatest minds that I've met in a long time. And I actually set up Robert to speak at a tech conference in Southeast Asia, particularly on this topic. And I don't think most of the audience actually understood, because this was about 3, maybe 4 years ago now, right? So people hear blockchain and just think of Bitcoin. And maybe if they're smarter, they think of Ethereum. But I think the conversation around this is so much deeper than just sort of the surface level of, cryptocurrency. So I want to talk about it so badly, because I have I have a lot of opinions on it, and if you go back and listen to some of our previous podcasts, you'll hear us talking about it. Frankly, we talked about it last night, again, on our weekly podcast. And I think there's room to spend more time talking about it and to have an expert like you, particularly someone who's been in the sort of fintech, and I don't want to pigeonhole this just for fintech, because I agree with you. It's a much larger and much wider. But
just in the fintech space, I can definitely talk about it.
Yeah, so huge, right?
Yes.
But now I want to ask you this, right? Because again, I look at your profile and I see something really interesting. In March of 2011, you founded Safecast.
Yes, and
so I think I know, but I'd rather have you talk about the genesis of that company, what it's been doing for the last 11 years, and kind of what the impact, not just on the gathering of data and radiation, right, but the impact on you personally. So why did you go out and start this? Where were you on March 11th, 2011, and how did that impact the founding and sort of the continuous running of Safecast, if that makes sense?
Yes. So let's start with the first. Where was I on March 11, March 11 of 2011, and I was in Tokyo.
Where were you?
Actually, together. Actually, I was at home at that time, and when the earthquake struck.
Interesting.
And I've been living in. Yeah, I was at home, and I've been living in Japan for over 25 years, right, and we've experienced the occasional good shake, but never anything like that.
Right.
And literally, and it's in Tokyo, so literally the earthquake was 400 kilometers away. So just imagine
I know. Just imagine what the epicenter was like
for people
in Sendai.
There must have been. Yeah, in Sendai must have been tremendous, right?
Yeah.
So so I'll never forget. You never know when it stops, and it kept on going. We were under the table and everything, and then after it was over, we switched on the TV, and then it said, it's hit Tohoku, and it hit Miyagi Prefecture. Now it so happens that my wife's family-in-law is from that area, and actually from a city called Ishinomaki, which was one of the worst hit cities in the tsunami. So when we switched on the TV, we saw helplessly we saw the waves hit my wife's hometown and other people's hometowns and everything. So first of all, very big helpless feeling. Long story short, we lost contact with our family. They were affected by the tsunami, but my direct family, everybody, actually made it through. But not can't say the same thing for some of their friends and their direct relationships. But that was very, very unsettling experience. But what really made it even more helpless was that the day after the tsunami, when Fukushima Daiichi started to get the meltdown and exploded, it also put basically a stop to the whole idea of going to help my family in Miyagi. Because that was the first 24 hours. I was trying to figure out what can I do? Can I go there? How can we help? Right. And then within 24 hours, that became increasingly an impossible idea. So it's basically this invisible wall of radiation uncertainty became a stopper, but also became a direct risk for my own family. My daughter at the time was around 7 years old, and being from Holland and remembering Chernobyl and those, that memory came back and said, well, where is that cloud going to go? And immediately, started to look at the internet, what's happening. Right. And very limited information. And it so happened that, my network, one of my good friends, Joe Ito, we were talking online and say, where can we get Geiger counters? He happened to be at that time not in Japan, he was in Boston, but his wife was here, and we were all kind of scrambling, and then other people got online, and we started to talk about what can we do. And there was a third person, Sean Bonner, who was in LA, and we started to talk, three of us, what can we do something about this lack of information, because that is kind of the key thing. Why would you run away if there is no danger? In case of, instead of running away, maybe we should stay here and help people. Right. So what is the right decision? If you don't have information, you tend to take the uncertain for certain, and I know quite a few people did that, and I think that makes perfect sense. Yep. But I didn't want to go. I wanted to stay because my family is here. Also, my heart is here, so I said, what can I do? So that kind of became a trigger for doing something. So then we wandered around a couple of weeks. Initially, the idea was to see if we could become kind of an information hub for information about radiation and the disasters. So we started to look around the internet and seeing, in Japan, are there any other sources of measurement? Can we consolidate them? Can we put them on a single map? None of that was realistic. All the information that was available was very limited. Whatever was available was in the wrong area, or was copyright protected, or simply not accessible. So we couldn't really do much. So our map was very empty. It had a few, dots around Tokyo, but nothing in Tohoku. So that was basically a fail after a week or so. Then we kind of said, okay, let's do crowdsourcing. Let's buy as many Geiger counters as we can, and then give these to people, and then hopefully they can report. So actually, we set up a website where people could start reporting radiation levels if they had a Geiger counter. But as you may remember, Geiger counters sold out literally in 24 hours.
I was going to say, like, the concept of going out and buying a Geiger counter after March 11th, 2011 was an impossibility because even people who didn't even understand what a Geiger counter was went out and bought one.
Right. It was kind of weird, and suddenly you had need for something you didn't even know existed.
Exactly.
And but the thing sold out, and the problem is that the core part of a Geiger counter, the so-called Geiger tube, is only manufactured by a few companies worldwide, and they have very limited capacity to produce. So not only was it sold out, the lead time increased from 6 months to 12 months. So we're kind of stuck with it. So we actually did a Kickstarter campaign at a time to collect money to actually build something. But
on
Kickstarter
itself?
On Kickstarter itself, and we got money actually to buy those Geiger counters, which I just talked about. And the thing is, we couldn't buy them, so we said, "What do we do now?" But the good thing is we had collected an amazing group of people on the internet that got together to kind of starting to talk about this and starting to help each other and say, "What can we do?" We were at that time we had a few Geiger counters that were donated by a person named Dan Saiti. He was actually involved in the Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island, and he had a small company that was making these devices. So we had literally a handful of these. Then another person that joined and helped us out was a person named Ray Ozzie. He was, if you're familiar with Ray Ozzie, he was the one who founded
Ray Ozzie. He founded Lotus 123, yeah.
Founded Lotus Notes and everything.
With Mitch Kapoor, yeah. So.
Yeah, so we were extremely blessed to have his input. So he came up with the idea: if we have only limited, why don't we try to put them on a car and drive them around?
I saw that.
So and nobody ever had done that before. So this was like, and some of the so-called scientists that were in this space said, "Oh, you can't do this and that, or whatever." So of course we did it, and so we together with people that were here at Tokyo Hackerspace and other people who were interested, we started to build a prototype of something that could be put on a car and could automatically measure. We did some experiments. We did something before that just actually see the overall idea would work at all. So we had David Kell. He was a volunteer with a group that was bringing up food to Second Harvest was the group, a great group. Second Harvest, he was a volunteer for Second Harvest, and they were bringing up food and relief goods up to Tohoku, Fukushima, etc. And so we gave him a Geiger counter and a mobile phone and said, "Can you measure along the way?" So he did that. We said, "Okay, hey, wow, interesting." But we also saw that the levels were a whole lot higher than we could see on NHK TV. So we knew something, something more was happening there. So we automated that process. It's very similar to what Google does with Street View. It's driving around every 5 seconds. The system takes a radiation measurement and collects, and puts the GPS coordinates and the timestamp and the value on an SD card. Right. That became something which we still call a B-Geigi. B stands for bento. It looks a little bit like a bento box, lunch box. And Geigi is for Geiger counter. So these things became our workhorse. So we hand build close to 100 of these in the first year, and we started handing them out to people in Fukushima. They started to drive around, and over time we started to basically fill in the map with radiation data, and that started to really show us that how blotchy the fallout was. It wasn't that the 20-kilometer exclusion zone had anything to do with where the radiation fallout was. It was kind of a policy statement more than anything else. The fallout went all the way up, 80 kilometers inwards, but close to the plant there were also areas that largely were unaffected. Like, for example, the city of Iwaki, one of the larger cities in Fukushima, almost didn't get any fallout, while cities like Koriyama, Nihonmatsu, and Fukushima City were very much badly affected. So that became kind of a goal for us. Instead of kind of getting an idea, we said, we need to measure this thing. And also when we met people in Fukushima, we found out that people really wanted to know what was happening in their own streets, not just a measurement at the city hall.
Right. People are really self-interested in a way, and in this case, I mean
yes.
that in the most positive way, not in a selfish way. They really want to know, like, can my children eat the food coming out of the ocean in my town, basically?
Yeah, so, it's kind of funny because you mentioned selfish, but I think it is kind of a selfish attitude that humans have in general to protect themselves.
Yeah, it's self-interest.
And you protect your children, you protect your family, and, that's kind of a selfish self-interest. But the selfish interest is important because it drives people to do something.
Correct.
And it drives almost any person to do something. While some other people, to overcome your selfishness, to become selfishness, etc., requires an additional level of energy, I think. But for everybody worries about themselves, their family, etc. So we had lots of volunteers that literally just worried about themselves and their neighborhoods. And they used the so-called big Geigis to start measuring those neighborhoods. So if you do that at a larger scale, literally, it's like crowdfunding in kind of a chaotic manner. It's very much like we talked about distributed trust networks. It's really like that. And so people in different parts of a city start measuring. But also what happens is they don't know who is measuring elsewhere. In Safecast, we don't coordinate where people measure. We help people to get the equipment. They decide where they measure. So what happens is, and this is kind of by design, people will measure the same spot at least a couple of times because in the same neighborhood, we'll have more people than one person measure. And that kind of creates kind of an automatic verification as well. So,
it almost sounds like the blockchain, just a human version.
Well, it's kind of interesting.
And I'm not saying that by accident. It sounds to me, and I'll let you say it as well because it is interesting, but it sounds to me like the concept of a block and a blockchain and public verification and all the trust associated with the group verification is something that humans do naturally anyway.
Exactly. And if you study the history of money or whatever, you'll find out money is actually a trust network. But,
absolutely.
So if you look at what happened with the measurements, is that actually a group of people that don't know each other, in other words, wouldn't trust each other,
exactly,
were collecting more or less in a random fashion data about their environment, but by putting it on the same map and overlaying it, it creates an automatic verification. So we were able to build trust out of a non-trusted group of people. Not that the people wouldn't trust each other after they would meet each other, but they would never meet each other.
Right,
So and that is kind of the trick, similar to, if you're familiar with Bitcoin, as you were saying, Bitcoin, the big thing is if there's a majority of miners, then the whole thing will fall over, right? That's the same thing in Safecast. The whole idea is that we don't have a dominant contributor to the project, so we really thrive on as many as different volunteers as possible to collect data using the same equipment and the same methodology, but by putting it together, we're able to create an environmental map that basically trumps any type of government activity trying to do the same.
I like it. So what's been so I want to back up and talk about this concept of a human blockchain and the concept of these people wouldn't know each other, but they trust each other, and the fact that they can meet in a way where they're working on a similar project and nobody is more self-interested than any other creates an environment where people are actually willing to verify and self-verify. It just all sounds like a white paper.
Yes.
So can you make the equivalency between that and what goes on in the real technology world and how those two things are related?
Yes, actually, you were mentioning it sounds like a white paper. We actually did write a scientific paper about the whole idea, and we published it about a year ago. So,
tell me. So,
yes, no, it was published in a journal for radiological protection. It's a 40-year-old, well-established scientific journal, quite prestigious. It took us close to a year to get it published in terms of peer reviews, all the scientific checks and balances. It was published about a year ago in June 2016. Interestingly enough, it ended up in the top 10 of most read papers for that journal in 2016.
What's the name of the paper?
The name of the paper,
Can you send me the link? I want to see the link.
Yeah, I'll send you the link. Yeah, I'll send you the link in a second. It has a long title, of course. It's a scientific paper, so I'd rather give you the link than trying to make a mistake. But we wrote it as a means to basically share, kind of the thinking around and behind how we work. So that is something. So you were talking. Sorry, I lost the context of the question. So
I just want to understand. I want to understand how. So here's the idea, right? Safecast says among other things, so I'm going to simplify a whole bunch of little concepts here, right? But Safecast basically says there's been a massive disaster and earthquake in the Fukushima and Sendai area in Japan. But nobody really knows, and nobody really has data to know what's going on, not just overall, right? So you talked about the 20-kilometer zone. If I remember correctly, in Chernobyl, they did an 80-kilometer zone, right? So they had an 80-kilometer radius around the power plant. And they said nobody's allowed in here for 30 years or whatever it was. They killed all the livestock and sort of evacuated everybody. So in Japan, you're saying, I don't know how much radiation is there. I don't know where it's concentrated. I don't know how far it's drifted away. I don't know what the impact is. How can we measure it? And how can we get people to just understand the whole concept of it? And then how can we kind of crowdsource all of that data? The real question is, though, is how can you trust an individual's self-interest to actually properly measure, to tell you the truth? Right, because you can game what's going on any individual piece of technology and Geiger counter, and yet you end up with a situation where there's not just self-verification, but group verification on all that data. And it just sounds to me a lot like the blockchain.
Yes, and it's a very essential question. So if you think about, first of all, we expect our governments to measure our environment.
Yes.
To be very frank, it's a very big expectation. We're very far away from actually even being close to that. But the problem with that model is that we put trust in one single entity. If that entity loses trust for whatever reason, for good or bad reasons, then whatever that entity collects in terms of data will be mistrusted. And so that is, and rebuilding that trust is very, very hard. Even today, if you go to Fukushima, you'll find many, many people still do not trust whatever the Japanese government is measuring, right, irrespectively of all the effort and whatever they're trying to do aside. That is kind of, even after 6 years, where lots of people are. So that's kind of a big dilemma if you work in these things as a central organization. So Safecast, by the way, we're a volunteer organization. We're not a company. We're no profit, but the whole idea is that people individually measure. One thing that is common between all the people is they use the same equipment and the same sensor. This was something we decided from day one. So
has to be for consistency, right?
For consistency. And, and some people say, is it really accurate or whatever? The real thing that is important is can we compare values between locations,
right,
with the level of consistency?
You talk about relative information, right? So
relative information.
Same, yeah.
Of course, the equipment we use actually uses very good sensor. It's been calibrated in laboratories over time, blah, blah, blah. But the real treat is that you can compare A with B. And that makes it powerful. And if people use the equipment collectively, then you can start comparing things. And of course, people can fist the data. You can put the Geiger counter in a lead bag, or you can strap some radioactive material on it, and you can say, oh, it's very high in Tokyo, or look how low Tokyo is, or whatever.
Right.
So this is a given, and and because we do not know if the person is trustworthy, and we have no process whatsoever to check who the volunteer is, and right, we allow anybody to participate. So it's very important that in Safecast we're not a pro-nuclear or anti-nuclear group. We're a pro-data group.
Right, you're not taking a view.
Yeah, we're not taking a view. So we believe as long as you follow the same process, you can be a volunteer in Safecast. So that means that there could be people there that have an agenda or whatever. And of course, we have many volunteers that have very different opinions about many things. But one thing that kind of connects the thing is let's use data to drive our thinking. So what happens is if multiple people measure the same location, if let's say one person has for example, the sensor could be broken for that matter.
Yep.
It doesn't even have to be a malintent. The sensor could be broken. Because things overlay, you can actually see when things are kind of out of expected range. That doesn't mean that the data is wrong. It could be something that is happening right there, right now. Also, by the way, if you measure radiation, that you may know that some people go for specific medical procedures where they are temporarily, ingest radioactive material.
Correct.
And that takes a couple of days to fizzle out. And if you stand next to a person, your Geiger counter will go haywire.
Right.
Right. So literally. And sometimes we see that, in a busy train station or somebody that passes a hospital, we sometimes have these kind of, one-time hotspots, so to speak. But so you see those things, and because people that participate, have declared themselves. If you want to, if you're going to run around like an idiot trying to break the system, you will just show up as that idiot
right,
breaking the system.
Right.
Okay, So you're doing this. You're even if you're anonymous, you still are. The data that is collected is immediately made public data. So we publish all our data under a Creative Commons zero license. That's basically public domain.
Yep.
So anybody can examine it. So it's not Safecast data anymore. And the other thing that's important is that the people that have measured keep the copy of their data as well. It's on an SD card with you on your machine or whatever. So even if in Safecast we start hacking the database or whatever, everybody that participates has their own copy still. They can always check back and say, hey, whatever is on the Safecast database, is that actually what I contributed? They can verify that back and forward as well. So there's many, there's many natural ways it kind of balances. All systems have weaknesses, and you can go and sit around and think through, and that's something why I'm looking at things like blockchain and other things as possible ways to even to make this even more robust and what have you. But the natural fact that people check each other actually balances out really well in reality. If you are sitting in a corner and you can fuzz things and nobody's watching you, catch me if you can type of thing.
Exactly.
People may do bad things, but if you put broad daylight on it, everybody can see what you're doing. Humans tend to behave a whole lot more reasonable.
Right. I mean, I have a concept that says nothing good happens in the dark. And I think what you're talking about with Safecast is, and you started with like government as a central entity for trust is probably a mistake that we make, particularly when it comes to the radiation data. But I would say it's actually a metaphor for a much larger mistake that humans make when they centralize kind of all decisions into one entity as an expert in any particular place. And so I like to make these equivalencies, and I think that the government doesn't necessarily try to do anything good, bad, or indifferent in most cases, but whenever there's a central entity that controls all the data, in the Safecast case, of course, what you're doing is taking that data away from the central control and distributing it, right? So this is the whole concept. But that's also why I believe really strongly that something like blockchain, which does that with all of the data that sits on it, right? That whole concept is that all the data is distributed, all of it's verified. It means that your ability to have this central control is now not eliminated, but it's disintermediated. And I think when we talk next, and hopefully we will talk next, I'm sure we will, about the impact and the ongoing impact and development of blockchain as a technology that's going to sort of become a more and more a part of people's lives. The metaphor that you talked about in the context of the government and the control of the data for nuclear information, right, and for radiation is going to have a very similar impact across a whole swath of, I wouldn't even just say industries, but pieces of our life where that data now becomes distributed in public. And you can see, here's the thing though, right, you made a really good point. You can now see the outliers in that data, so measurements that are way too high. And again, in some cases it is because someone's self-interested in trying to get something based on that data, or just there's a person next to you who went to the hospital, like you said, who's randomly standing next to you at a train station, or you're driving past them if you're making those measurements in a car. But I think that's what makes this whole concept of distributed data really interesting, and Safecast is a really great test for this sort of metaphorical idea that decentralizing the trust and the data is actually not a bad idea. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. And I think just to come back on governments, I think, if we're looking back over the last few years, and specifically over the last year with some of the things that are happening in the US, where we have taken things way too much for granted in terms of how governments can behave or can change dramatically, specifically if it comes to control over data or how data is managed. And in the case of Japan, I think Japan wasn't ready obviously for this disaster.
No.
But also the technology, the scientists, the engineers, nobody had ever thought about what do we do if we really have a disaster like this? How do we measure it?
Right.
So, the whole idea to go out with, the Japanese government had a bunch of Geiger counters, to go out and go measure in the field was kind of completely not realistic. And they never had thought it would be such a big field. But at the same time, I think that, expecting too much from the government is kind of naive.
Exactly.
And I think when those things happen, I think it is, and I was definitely, part of that, we as citizens are not kind of the end consumer that, will, waits patiently to get something presented on a silver plate. We have, I think, an obligation and the power and the abilities to stand up and do something and team up. And I think those are the opportunities for communities and people living in communities to say, okay, this is something we never had. Why don't we build it now?
Right.
And I think, if you look at the amazing advance over the last 10 years in terms of mobile technology, 3D printing, some of the IoT stuff, open source, open hardware, all of these things have made it increasingly possible to do things that were completely unimaginable 10 years ago in terms of quickly being able to build systems, infrastructure, communities, etc. It's really a very different ballgame altogether. The internet, obviously, being the big connector, allowing it all of that to happen. You can order any little tiny part within a day. You can assemble something in a week's time. You can be on the road the day after. That type of empowerment is entirely there. I think that creates opportunities to, as you said, to build systems that can verify, but also it creates, I think, a healthy dialogue between citizens and their central governments or local governments to say, what do we expect from you, but how can I participate in that? And by participating, you not only say let's measure something or whatever, but you also get engaged much more into that. In Safecast, we started off with measuring radiation, but over the last 2 years or so, we have been increasingly working on how can we measure air quality and air pollution.
Right, same thing, right?
And it's the same thing. It's something that plays all over the world. We're talking about things like global warming, but the problem is that engagement with global warming is very limited for the reason that it doesn't directly affect your lives in a way that is visible.
Yet.
However,
Yet. I would say yet. Yes.
No, it does. I agree with you. Not yet, or whatever. But it does not in a way that people start to say, "Oh my God, I need to do something." They read it in the newspaper and say, "Oh my God." But in terms of really at local community level. But if you talk about air pollution or whatever, most people do worry about it because it does affect your health. And if that is connected to global warming or not, that is something where people, I think, can much more easily understand that, hey, I don't want this. And that type of engagement, I think, is important to go and do something about things. So I think air pollution and measuring that at local levels is a very important thing. And so we have been, on many people's requests, we have been working on that. And this year, we have come out with a new version of our systems called the SolarCast, which is a system that is measuring both air pollution and radiation. It's very easy to deploy, and we're now doing testing and trying this out and see how we can build a network of these sensors and get a much better idea of air pollution at a much more granular level in cities or wherever, so that we can really start understanding how is that affecting us and where is it coming from, how could we potentially do something about it.
I think that's fascinating, actually, and this is a perfect place to end. The last thing I want to ask you is, how do you fund Safecast? Is it a registered nonprofit organization, and how does it get funded?
Yes, we are a nonprofit. We're registered in the US as a nonprofit organization. We're registered in Japan as a nonprofit, and we have a nonprofit in Europe. And this is basically to allow people to donate to the cause. The way we work is in two fields. Lots of the donations are in kind, meaning people spend their time measuring and spend their time helping the project. So we have lots of people in the field. At this point in time, I think over the last 6 years, we have almost now collected 75 million measurements.
Wow.
We're doing about 2 million measurements a month. And obviously, running a project that scale requires people and continuous engagement. So we have a project team of people that are working on it, largely volunteer. But we collect donations to basically run our logistics, pay for equipment, we do lots of reach-out events,
right.
Seminars, and things like that. So, and that is very much something that depends on donations.
Well, let's try to use the power of the internet and the podcast to get more donations. I mean, if there's a link as well for how people can connect to Safecast, yes, the organization, where they can sort of make donations, I'd like to highlight that if that's okay with you.
Sure. Yes, I'll share the link after the call is over.
That would be super. You can just put it into the Skype chat. Look, let's do this. Yes. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to just talk to us. I think this has been fabulous, and I really believe this is just the beginning of a conversation, not just about the technology, but how technology affects humans and groups, and how the blockchain is going to get used for a whole bunch of different things that people haven't even conceptualized yet. So I'd like to sort of have a a tacit agreement that we're going to get back on the phone again, maybe in a few months, just to sort of follow up, if for no other reason than I was there on March 11th as well. I remember the confusion, the fear. So I was sitting on a trading desk at 2:47 in the afternoon on Friday, and I know that feeling, just like you said. I'd been there at the point for 21 years as well, and when an earthquake hit, it was just like people would look at each other and just say those two words, right? Jishin desu. Right?
Yes.
It's an earthquake. You'd be like, yeah, sure, fine. Let's just move on because there are earthquakes almost every day. Some of them you feel, some of them you don't. And yet this one just didn't stop. And you're right. If you're sitting on the 20th floor of the New Otani Garden Court building and the shaking and shaking and shaking, you can only begin to imagine what it must have been like, right? Up near Sendai, up near Fukushima, and just that fear and that feeling of just complete lack of control. And the idea that Safecast grew out of this and the ability to sort of measure and help test and, like you say, just get people involved. And if you can extrapolate that further into the future with things like SolarCast and the creation of data and this sort of distribution of not just responsibility but data collection, I think is really powerful.
Yes. No, and I'm happy to talk again for sure. I think we have a few things in common. We should definitely reconnect.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you again, Pieter Franken. That was great.
Michael, thank you so much.
You've been listening to Asia Tech Podcast. Find out more at www.asiatechpodcast.com.